If your plants keep turning yellow, developing strange spots on the leaves, collapsing from root rot, or simply refusing to grow no matter how much fertilizer you buy, there is a good chance you are overlooking something that costs less than a cup of coffee and may already be sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now. I learned this lesson the hard way after losing tomato seedlings, pepper plants, cucumbers, and even some flowers that looked perfectly healthy one week and completely miserable the next. Like most people, I thought the answer was more fertilizer, more products, more complicated solutions. I spent money on bottles with fancy labels and promises of bigger harvests. But year after year, I kept running into the same problems. Leaves turning yellow for no obvious reason. Soil staying wet for too long after rain. Mold showing up where it should not be. Seedlings dying before they ever had a chance to get started. What surprised me was that one of the simplest tools I eventually started using was ordinary 3% hydrogen peroxide. Not some expensive gardening formula, not a special commercial treatment, just the same bottle many people already keep at home. The interesting part is that most gardeners either never use it or use it the wrong way. Some pour too much and damage tender plants. Others try it once, see no result, and never touch it again. Meanwhile, there are gardeners quietly using it to help seeds sprout better, reduce certain fungal problems, improve oxygen around roots, and even help plants recover when soil becomes too wet. Over the years, I have found several practical ways to use it around both the garden and the house. None of them are difficult. None require special equipment, and most of them take only a few minutes. Today, I want to walk you through 9 different uses that have helped me deal with sick plants, damp soil, fungus problems, and a few common garden pests. Some of these methods were shown to me many years ago by older gardeners who rarely wasted money on expensive products. They preferred simple solutions that actually worked. A few of these tricks surprised me so much that I started using them every season, and the very first method is probably the one that saves more seedlings than any other, because this is exactly where most gardeners unknowingly make their biggest mistake. The first thing I want you to understand is why so many plants get into trouble in the first place. Most gardeners focus on what they can see above the soil. They look at leaves, stems, flowers, and fruit, but many of the problems actually begin below the surface where nobody is looking. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen someone add more fertilizer to a struggling plant when the real problem was that the roots were sitting in soil that stayed wet for too long. When soil becomes waterlogged, roots begin to suffer because they need oxygen just as much as they need water. Without enough oxygen, roots become weak, growth slows down, leaves start yellowing, and fungal problems begin to appear. The gardener sees the yellow leaves and assumes the plant is hungry. So they add more fertilizer. The roots become even more stressed and the situation gets worse. I made that mistake myself years ago. I remember looking at a row of pepper plants that seemed perfectly watered, yet they were growing slower every week. The leaves lost their healthy color, and a few plants started collapsing for no obvious reason. It was frustrating because I felt like I was doing everything right. What I eventually learned is that healthy roots are often more important than feeding. A plant with strong roots can find nutrients on its own. A plant with damaged roots struggles no matter how much you feed it. This is where hydrogen peroxide became interesting to me. When diluted properly, it can help introduce additional oxygen into wet soil conditions and create an environment that is less friendly to some of the problems that develop when moisture lingers too long. Now, I am not talking about miracles. It will not bring back a dead plant. But I have seen stressed plants recover surprisingly well when the real issue was excessive moisture around the roots. The funny thing is that most people keep watering when they notice a struggling plant. They think the plant looks weak because it is thirsty. Often the opposite is true. The roots are drowning. In a few minutes, I will show you one of the simplest ways I use hydrogen peroxide around roots and seedlings. It takes almost no effort, costs very little, and it is one of those old gardening tricks that many younger gardeners have never heard about. But before we get there, There is another place where most plant problems actually begin, and almost nobody pays attention to it until it is too late. One of the biggest surprises for many gardeners is that some plant problems start long before the plant ever reaches the garden bed. They begin with the seed. Most people buy seeds, put them into trays or small pots, water them, and wait. Sometimes everything goes well. Other times half the seeds never sprout, seedlings emerge weak, or a fuzzy white mold starts appearing on the soil surface. Many gardeners simply accept this as bad luck. I used to think the same way. Then an older gardener showed me a simple method that he had been using for years. Before planting certain seeds, he would soak them for a short time in a very weak hydrogen peroxide solution. The goal was not to force growth or perform some magic trick. The idea was much simpler. Seeds naturally carry tiny amounts of bacteria, fungal spores, and other microorganisms on their outer surfaces. Most of the time, they are harmless, but sometimes they contribute to poor germination or early seedling problems. By giving seeds a brief soak before planting, he was helping create a cleaner starting point. I was skeptical at first because it sounded almost too simple. But after trying it on peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, and a few flower varieties, I started noticing more consistent germination. The difference was not dramatic every single time, but it was enough that I kept doing it season after season. What really convinced me was what happened in my seed trays. There was less mold on the surface and fewer weak seedlings struggling during those first critical weeks. Now, here is where many people make a mistake. They hear about hydrogen peroxide and assume more must be better. That is rarely true in gardening. Most problems come from using too much rather than too little. Simple and gentle usually works best. The old gardeners who taught me these methods were never dumping large amounts onto their plants. They used small amounts carefully and only when there was a reason. That mindset alone can save you a lot of money and disappointment. Another thing I noticed is that healthier seedlings often stay healthier throughout the season. A strong start gives plants an advantage that follows them for months. Weak seedlings spend the entire year trying to catch up, and when summer heat arrives or disease pressure increases, those weak plants are usually the first to struggle. But seed starting is only the beginning, because there is another hydrogen peroxide use that became one of my favorites after I nearly lost an entire group of container plants following several days of heavy rain. That experience taught me something most gardeners discover only after losing a few plants. A few summers ago, we had one of those weeks that every gardener knows. Rain after rain after rain. The ground never seemed to dry. The air felt heavy. Every morning I walked outside and could almost feel the moisture hanging over the garden. At first I was not worried because water is supposed to help plants grow. Then I started noticing warning signs. A few leaves began yellowing. Some container plants looked droopy even though the soil was soaking wet. One tomato plant seemed to stop growing completely. That is when I remembered something an older gardener told me years earlier. He said the danger is often not the water itself. The danger is what happens when roots sit in wet soil for too long. The oxygen around the roots begins to disappear and problems start building quietly underground before you ever see them above the surface. So I mixed a simple diluted hydrogen peroxide solution and used it on a few of the worst-looking containers. I was not expecting a miracle. I simply wanted to help the soil recover from all that excess moisture. Over the next several days, I noticed something interesting. The plants that had looked tired and stagnant began showing signs of new growth. The leaves looked firmer. Growth points became active again. Not every plant recovered completely, but enough of them improved that I paid attention. Since then, I have kept this method in mind whenever prolonged rain or overwatering becomes a problem. The reason many gardeners like hydrogen peroxide in these situations is because it breaks down into water and oxygen. That extra oxygen can be helpful in soil conditions that have stayed overly wet. Again, this is not something I use constantly. Most of the time, proper watering solves the problem, but when conditions become extreme, it can be a useful tool to have available. What many people do not realize is that container plants are especially vulnerable. A garden bed has a larger volume of soil and often drains more naturally. Containers can become saturated quickly, especially if drainage holes are blocked or the potting mix has broken down over time. I always tell people to check drainage before buying another fertilizer or treatment. Many struggling plants are simply sitting in soil that cannot breathe properly. The good news is that this is usually an inexpensive problem to fix. And speaking of inexpensive solutions, the next use for hydrogen peroxide may be the one that has saved me the most frustration over the years because it involves something every gardener eventually faces: fungus. Once you see where fungus likes to start, you begin looking at your plants very differently. Fungus is one of those problems that seems to appear overnight. One day, everything looks healthy and normal. Then suddenly there are strange spots on the leaves, a white, powdery coating, dark patches near the stems, or mold growing where it has no business being. Most gardeners immediately start looking for a product to buy. I understand why, because I used to do exactly the same thing. But over time, I learned that many fungal problems become serious because we ignore the early warning signs. The fungus itself is often not the first problem. Excess moisture, poor airflow, overcrowded plants, and wet leaves usually create the conditions that allow fungus to get comfortable. Once I understood that, I started paying much closer attention to prevention. One of the simplest uses for hydrogen peroxide around the garden is as part of a basic cleanup routine when fungal issues begin appearing. I have used it on seed trays, empty pots, garden tools, and other surfaces that can harbor unwanted spores. Many gardeners spend money replacing containers every year when a simple cleaning can often help prepare them for another season. An old gardener once told me that disease prevention starts before the first seed is planted. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Now, I think he was absolutely right. A few minutes spent cleaning trays, containers, and tools can save weeks of frustration later. I also learned another lesson the hard way. Most people focus only on the plant that looks sick. They forget about everything around it. The fungus may be visible on one plant, but spores can be sitting on nearby pots, trays, stakes, and tools waiting for the next opportunity. That is why I try to think about the whole growing area rather than a single leaf or stem. What surprised me most over the years is how often simple habits outperform expensive products. Better airflow, proper spacing, removing damaged leaves early, keeping containers clean, avoiding constant overwatering. These habits cost almost nothing and often make a bigger difference than any bottle from a garden center shelf. Hydrogen peroxide became just one more tool in that approach. Not the solution to everything, but a useful helper when used carefully and sensibly. And there is another place where it can be surprisingly useful that has nothing to do with leaves or stems. In fact, it involves something hidden beneath the soil surface that many gardeners never think about until their plants suddenly stop growing. Once I discovered this next method, I started looking at old potting soil in a completely different way. The next use surprised me because I originally discovered it by accident while reusing old container soil. Like many gardeners, I hate wasting perfectly good potting mix. At the end of a season, I often have containers full of soil that still looks decent. The problem is that old soil can sometimes develop hidden issues. It may stay wet longer than it should. It may contain leftover fungal spores. Sometimes roots from previous plants begin decomposing and creating conditions that are less than ideal for new seedlings. Years ago, I planted a fresh batch of vegetables into reused soil and noticed that growth was unusually slow. The seedlings survived, but they never seemed truly happy. An experienced gardener suggested refreshing the soil rather than throwing it away. He explained that old potting mix often needs air, organic matter, and sometimes a little help before being used again. That conversation eventually led me to another practical use for hydrogen peroxide. Some gardeners use a diluted solution when refreshing old container soil, especially when they suspect the mix has stayed damp for long periods or may contain unwanted microbial buildup. What I like about this approach is that it fits perfectly with the idea of saving money. Instead of buying brand new soil every season, you can often improve what you already have. For people gardening on a budget, that matters. Gardening should not require spending large amounts of money every spring. Some of the best gardeners I have ever known were incredibly careful with resources. They reused containers. They saved seeds. They composted everything possible, and they looked for simple solutions before expensive ones. Another place where hydrogen peroxide has earned a spot in my routine is around cuttings and plant propagation. If you enjoy rooting plants from cuttings, you know that rot can become a problem before roots ever have a chance to develop. Clean containers and clean water make a difference. Many people focus entirely on rooting hormones while overlooking basic cleanliness. In my experience, healthy propagation often begins with reducing unnecessary problems rather than forcing faster growth. The interesting thing is that every method we have discussed so far follows the same principle. We are not trying to overpower nature. We are simply creating conditions where plants have a better chance to succeed. That approach has helped me far more than chasing miracle products. But we still have 3 important uses left to discuss, including one that many people use indoors around houseplants and another that can help deal with certain garden pests in a surprisingly simple way. And the final method might be the easiest of all because almost anyone can start using it today without spending another dollar. When I look back at all the years I have spent gardening, one lesson keeps coming up again and again. The best solutions are often the simplest ones. We live in a time when there seems to be a special product for every problem. Yellow leaves. Buy a product. Fungus. Buy another product. Slow growth. Buy something else. Before long, a gardener can spend a small fortune chasing solutions without ever addressing the real issue. What I appreciate about ordinary 3% hydrogen peroxide is not that it solves everything. It does not. No single product does. What I appreciate is that it can serve several useful purposes without costing much money or taking up much space on a shelf. We talked about helping seeds get off to a cleaner start. We talked about dealing with overly wet soil conditions that can stress roots. We discussed cleaning containers and gardening equipment. We looked at refreshing old potting mixes and supporting healthier propagation practices. We touched on helping reduce conditions that allow certain fungal problems to gain a foothold. And many gardeners also use diluted hydrogen peroxide around houseplants, where overwatering is one of the most common mistakes. Then there are certain soft-bodied garden pests that often appear when plants are already stressed. Healthy plants tend to resist problems better than weak ones, which is why I always focus on plant health first. The real value of all these methods is not complexity, it is simplicity. Most of them take only a few minutes. Most cost very little. And nearly all of them fit the old-fashioned gardening mindset that I have come to respect more every year. Use what works, avoid waste, keep things simple. Pay attention to the plants. The plants usually tell you what they need if you watch carefully enough. What I find most satisfying is knowing that a small, inexpensive bottle can sometimes help protect a season's worth of work. Not because it performs miracles, but because it supports good gardening habits. That is the difference many people miss. Good habits create healthy gardens. Simple tools help those habits succeed. So the next time you notice yellow leaves, damp soil, moldy seed trays, weak seedlings, or a struggling houseplant, remember that the solution may be much simpler than you think. And if you found even one useful idea in today's video, stay with me because there is another forgotten garden method I use every season that costs almost nothing, improves soil naturally, and most gardeners walk right past it without ever realizing its value.